Ladies and gentlemen, heartily welcome. Thank you very much for taking the opportunity on a Friday afternoon with very nice weather to join us in this room, and I think you probably will not regret it. It's a great pleasure for me to have this meeting today on the topic of 70 years of NATO. And therefore, we invited not only one of the top experts, international experts on transatlantic relations, but also two people from newer members of NATO, one of Poland and one of Croatia. But before I introduce them, I just want to say hello. Thank you very much for coming. I see not everybody I have on the list is here. I see other people who I don't have on the list. They are here. Ambassador Sultana, the Ambassador of Sudan. I see many other people. Peter Heider from Universal Peace Federation and some academics. Thank you very much for coming. It's a great pleasure you are here. We will start with the representatives of two organizations that are cooperating partners. The one is Dorota Kafara. She comes from Poland, and already for 10 years she has experience in organizing the very well-known economic forum in Krynica, which is one of the biggest political events, I think, all over the world, with more than 4,000 guests. But she will also say a few words of welcome and introduce the organization. And then we also will have a short statement of Antun Dujmovic from the Institute for Development and International Relations in Zagreb. He also will give us a short introduction, and then we will concentrate on Stanley Sloan. I guess everybody knows him. He is somebody who shaped the transatlantic relationship not only for years but for decades. He was one of the most engaged and busiest counselors for American administrative and legislative institutions like the Congress, and I do not want to go into media, and he has published a lot. And of course, in a situation where for the first time in history, the American president asked or put the question after more or less the deeper meaning of NATO, it is necessary to talk about. He will try to give us a few answers then, and then of course you will have the opportunity to ask all the questions you have to this topic or to any transatlantic question. Insofar, I want to give a hearty welcome to our three speakers, and want to invite Dorota Kafara to start with a welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Fasslabend. Thank you very much for coming to our event. As Mr. Fasslabend mentioned, I represent the Polish Institute for Eastern Studies, the organizer of the Economic Forum in Krynica, but we take part also in different international projects. And this meeting is a part of a wide project celebrating 70 years of NATO, and also another anniversary, 20 years of joining Poland in NATO. And The founder of this project is the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. You have, some of you have at chairs the publication that consists of several articles of experts being a part of this project. And a part of this meeting and this debate, we organize also several debates in 10 European countries and also in Washington. So our idea is to use those anniversaries to have an occasion to discuss the future of NATO and also the role of the newest member states. And I have one technical question for you. Those of us who have this short questionnaire, I would just kindly ask to leave at the table outside. Thank you very much, and I wish a fruitful debate.
Thank you very much for your words of welcome. We appreciate it very much. You are coming to here and also being ready to answer any questions concerning Poland and the importance of NATO or the consequences of the nowadays situation for your home country. And now please, if you, Antun Dujmovic, say a few words from the Croatian side.
Okay. Thank you. Does this work?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Okay, first of all, I would like to thank AIES for organizing this event. It's a good opportunity, and it's a follow-up of our conversation that we had just a couple of weeks ago in Krynica. So I also want to thank the Institute for Eastern Studies in Warsaw for organizing not just this event, other events, but for making this publication come to life, and for choosing IRMO as one of your partners. IRMO has been founded in 1963, and ever since Croatia gained its independence in 1991, we've been involved in many EU-funded projects and projects relating to Euro-Atlantic integration. So just a few words on our perspective on NATO and its future. So the question that's been sort of risen these days is NATO still needed? You know, it's been here for 70 years, and some people want to euthanize it, they want to kill NATO. They said it's done its part when the Soviet Union collapsed. But in our perception, NATO is still a valid organization and quite needed in the future, and the unfolding events in the world really show that the necessity of the existence of NATO and further strengthening and cohesion within NATO. A lot has been said about Russia, you know, like the most imminent threat coming from the east, but I would say that the biggest threat to NATO comes from within our ranks. We saw first drift, first draw, first crack within this relationship between the US and Europe in 2003 after the Iraq invasion. I would say that a major blow was given in Bucharest when Germany and France opted to stop the map, and thus they blocked Georgian and Ukrainian path toward NATO, and we saw what happened a few months later in Georgia and in 2014 in Ukraine. And now I would say the greatest sort of threat to the existence of NATO are the voices coming basically mostly from the European side, not that much American. Regardless of the rhetoric of President Trump, I think that support for NATO is unanimous in the United States, more or less unanimous. But in Europe we see big division on crucial subjects, or on crucial ideas, on crucial European policies. We have one of the examples like Nord Stream 2. We have Germany supporting that big multi-billion project that's going to bring closer Russia to the heart of Europe. And we can see strong opposition to that project coming from the Baltic states and from Poland. Of course, we have different statements, different initiatives that also undermine the cohesion of NATO. In February this year, we heard President Macron of France state, and even voices from Germany saying that we are now facing not just threats from Russia and China, but also from the United States, which is for me obnoxious. We should be partners and not having, to perceive the Americans as a threat. And of course, you all remember different statements when you have like big drills, big military exercises in Europe. There was one big 3 years ago in Poland. It was called Anaconda, and then Frank-Walter Steinmeier said that it is a warmongering coming from NATO against Russia. So before he became president of Germany, he was Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time of Germany. So we see how Europe is divided when it comes to transatlantic cooperation. But then again, I strongly believe that this transatlantic cooperation is the backbone of not just our cooperation, but also of security in Europe, and it's unimaginable to perceive security in Europe without NATO. And just a little update on what's been going on in the Balkans. Croatia perceives itself as a Mediterranean, Middle European country, but also part of our country belongs to the Balkans, and we are strongly connected and linked to other countries in the region that used to form Yugoslavia. So Croatia is fully dedicated to European and to Euro-Atlantic integration. Now we reached the 1.75 threshold, so the 2% threshold is going to be reached within a couple of years. We're near closing that gap of 0.25%. Croatia fully supports initiatives that are bringing European allies closer together. We support, basically, Croatia launched this initiative, Intermarium, the 3 Cs initiatives together with Poland. Poland has been more successful and much bigger than us. We're 4 million, we're almost 4 million. And your part has been done. The LNG terminal already receives shale gas from the Bay of Mexico. Croatia just started a month ago construction works on LNG terminal Kirk, so I believe the 2 sides of Europe, the Baltic and Adriatic, will be connected within a couple of years, and this will greatly enhance not just energy security, but overall security of Europe, of Eastern Europe, and our collaboration within NATO. The rest of the region is not that promising. Serbia is going to join Euro-Asian, or basically it's a Russian union. This union is based in Moscow. They have Central Asian countries here, and Serbia, a landlocked country within the heart of Europe, is going to join this union. And this is a big, I wouldn't call it a threat, but it's a challenge to Western allies, to the Americans and to Europeans as well. Of course, you might be aware of the situation in Bosnia-Herzegovina. It's not a functional state. You have Milorad Dodik, who fully supports integration with this Euro-Asian Union and is strongly opposing membership of Bosnia-Herzegovina within NATO. Good example is Montenegro. They joined just 2 years ago, but still they have a lot of work to do. Northern Macedonia has been able to reach some momentum now with this agreement with Greece, but still they have. It's a long way. Before they can become fully stable, because there's a lot of in all of this, not just Macedonia, but Serbia and other countries in the region. There's a lot of Russian involvement, or the Chinese are coming in on the Great Door, and there's the growing Turkish involvement, and of course you see how they're defecting more and more from NATO. So the region as a whole is facing new challenges. So that's a little update from the Croatian side and from the region, and now I will pass the floor to you.
Thank you very much. And before I want to give now the floor to Stanley Sloan, I just want to thank also the organizer from our side, Dorota Kafara, the head of our institute, with the whole team. And when I say the whole team, then this also means, of course, Stanley Sloan, because for some years already he is a research fellow, not resident in India, but every time he comes, he's ready to make presentations in our institute, and we are very thankful for that. Okay, and now please, Stan, take the floor.
I'm going to go over here. So
Yeah.
see everybody. I enjoy joining with you in a somewhat more intimate way. But thank you for the introduction, Werner, and thank you for the background on the Polish Institute and also on the situation in Croatia, which is very valuable. I might have one little difference with you that you probably know from our earlier discussion today. I guess as an American who's worked on European affairs for so long, I'm very used to Europeans being divided, and so that seems very normal to me. That's what I've been reporting on to the executive branch of the Congress for 50 years. On the other hand, it seems very unusual to me for an American president to threaten to pull U.S. troops out of Europe and to abandon NATO, and so that, to my mind, seems like perhaps more threatening than some other things. What I'm going to do is talk about the future of what we call the West and how it should be defended, and then what would our answers to those questions mean for the two main institutional pillars of the West, which is the European Union and NATO. I'll define a little bit first what I mean by the West, because the definition is important. Summarize some of the challenges to it, the threats that it faces. And then I'm going to present 3 alternative scenarios. Now, these are scenarios that I have written as part of the update of my book on the history of transatlantic security relations. And so in some ways I'll be trying them out on you to see what kind of reactions you have to them. I should let you know first that I have some biases. I strongly support liberal democracy. I believe it's the best, even though not necessarily perfect, political system for our countries. My outlook on how to defend the West, therefore, is very much influenced by this ideological bias or set of political beliefs, and the need, as is the need for governments to defend against physical threats to citizens, the nation, and allied democracies. Finally, in my 50 years of working on transatlantic relations, I've analyzed and written about many crises. We've had them historically, at least one a decade, sometimes more than one a decade. But it is my judgment that the crisis currently facing the West is the most serious of all, and some earlier crises at the time seemed to threaten the future of the transatlantic relationship. No ally, however, has ever left NATO, and until Brexit, no country had left the European Union. And so with Brexit going on now, and some of the other things that are happening in the international environment, and with the threat from the American president to abandon Europe, I find this as the most dangerous crisis that we've ever had in the history of the alliance. How do I define the West? It's important because President Trump, when he went to Poland 2 years ago, defined the West in a way that I think poses issues and is somewhat difficult for me anyway. His definition of the West that he presented when he was in Poland was that it was based on the bonds of culture, faith, and tradition that make us who we are. My definition is different. It's based on what you find in virtually all of the major documents of the European Union and also in the preamble to the North Atlantic Treaty of NATO's founding document. And basically, I define the West as Western nations that aspire to and judge themselves against the goal of governing with systems that honor individual liberty, electoral democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. And what's different about my definition, and one that I think is shared by a lot of other people, and President Trump's definition, is that my definition doesn't exclude anybody of a different faith other than Christianity. It doesn't exclude people of different faiths. It doesn't exclude people with different cultures. It doesn't exclude people with different skin colors. And I think those are the dangers of the president's definition, that it tends to narrow down the people that he counts as being in the West. My definition is based on political values. Those political values can be adopted and pursued, followed by anybody from any culture, from any faith, of any skin color. And I think it's very important to understand that democracy, individual liberty, human rights, and the rule of law can capture anyone, and therefore is a very open concept. I can understand that there are very differences, that not everyone would share that point of view, but that's my definition. I would say if the fate of the West rests on its transatlantic core, which when I see the two institutions of the West, as I suggested, the main ones are the European Union and NATO, and I understand that there are Western countries that are not in the transatlantic area. Obviously, there are Asian countries that are democracies and that can be counted as part of the West. But I still see the transatlantic democracies as the core of the West. And to some extent, democracies have a problem. They can be very slow to change. They can seem to be unresponsive to the problems of the people. And we have that problem in the United States. You have that problem here in Austria. Because countries built on solid constitutional foundations find that major changes need to be considered seriously and tested before public opinion. That said, democracies that don't deal effectively with the concerns of the populace are vulnerable to pressure from fear-based populist appeals. Such pressures have troubled most of the transatlantic democracies in recent years. We've had a problem in the United States, you've had some problems here in Austria, other European countries as well. Those pressures have been aided and abetted by politicians seeking to build their power through playing on popular fears and making promises of strong leadership to respond to those fears. At the same time, states with undemocratic political systems are increasingly taking advantage of the openness of liberal democratic systems, freedom of the press, and social media to undermine the democratic systems that they see as threats to their more centralized and controlling systems of government. If I were a European who believes in Western values, I'd be worried, very worried, at least as worried as I am as an American. The American guarantee of European security has, under President Trump, become very uncertain. I see the challenges to the alliance as coming both from inside the alliance, as has already been suggested, and also from outside. Now, let me just very briefly go through my perception of this threat environment. From the inside, I see the alliance being threatened largely by illiberal, radical, illiberal right-wing groups and parties. These are the leaders and the parties that I say play on fears of the public, take concerns of the populace and suggest that they're the only ones that can solve the problems. President Trump came to office saying, I am the only one who can solve your problems for you. And so we have that problem in the United States, but I see it also in Europe as well. And these people are not committed to the Western values that I think are important. They tend not to support NATO or the European Union. They tend to be critical of both those organizations. They tend to be very supportive of President Putin and to admire his leadership style. And I think that this is the biggest internal threat to the alliance. So these people on the radical right who believe that they can respond to the concerns of the people by building up their fears and saying that they're the only ones who can deal successfully with those fears. Now there's an interaction between those internal challenges to the alliance and the external threats. In the case of Russia, and I believe President Putin is a brilliant leader. He, let's say, understands what some of the weaknesses are in our political system. I don't think President Putin has ever been seriously concerned about NATO invading or attacking Russia. He's created that image partly to maintain his own domestic political control. And it's an image that's politically useful for him. But he knows that the North Atlantic Council is never going to get the consensus required to initiate an unprovoked attack on Moscow. What is his strategy? What is his fear? His fear is that the model of democracy of the West presented by Western countries that were invited to join NATO and did become NATO members, that model is one that could be threatening to his control in Russia. He doesn't want Russians to believe that they too could adopt this kind of a political system that gives individual liberty, that is the kind of open political systems that we have among EU and NATO countries. So there's an interaction between President Putin, and of course he supports the radical right-wing illiberal movements in Europe and in the United States. And we saw in our 2016 elections, he provided direct support to President Trump for his election. We don't know how much that helped, but we do know that he, in the intelligence community, that I happen to trust. President Trump doesn't, but that's another difference between the president and my perspective. In any case, there's this relationship between the Russian threat and the internal threats inside our political system. There's also a relationship between another threat and our political systems, and that is the threat of terrorism. And we seem to have dealt somewhat effectively now with that challenge, but it was the terrorist activities, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and the turmoil in North Africa and the Middle East that drove refugees into Europe, the refugees presenting challenges to European countries and presenting a huge burden on European countries. And a lot of that burden stimulated the fear tactics of the radical right in Europe. And I won't go any further with that, just to say that again, there's a direct relationship between what terrorism sought, because what did ISIS want? ISIS wanted to destabilize the West. And to some extent, it has been successful in doing so. That also happened to be an objective of Mr. Putin. So here we have two of our challenges presenting political as well as military or terrorist-induced challenges. Now we have another challenge, and that is presented by China. I think probably 10 years ago, if I were giving this talk, I wouldn't have said anything about China. And all of a sudden, China is becoming something that not only the United States is dealing with or trying to calculate how to deal with, it's something that Europeans now seem to be focusing more attention on. And Lena Takharova, the director of the Institute, has done some good work already in this area and pointed out that there is a danger of China and Russia collaborating against the West. Neither of those countries support the ideals and the political systems that we have in the West. So they both are not only potential military adversaries, but they're also potential adversaries for control of the system, the international system. China's challenge is more subtle than that posed by Russia or by the terrorists. It is one that we have no idea exactly how to deal with, because China is spreading its power through investment and trade and things that seem relatively innocent. And whether it is innocent or not, we will find out in the long run, but I think at this point, we also have to start thinking about the fact that China does not believe in the individual liberties, the role of democracy, the rule of law that govern our countries in the West. And so China is emerging through its own subtle approach as another challenge externally to the Western way of life. Cutting short this process, let me suggest those three scenarios that I talked about, and I want to leave plenty of time for discussion and questions and answers. Now, all three of these scenarios assume certain things. I assume that Russia still poses political and military challenges, even while its economy tends to weaken. I presume that the threat of terrorist attacks will persist. I presume that concerns about Chinese power will mix with opportunistic cooperative deals with China. And I also assume that the UK will leave the European Union, although who knows at this point. Right now, that would be, I think, the best bet, unfortunately. I think the thing to think about Brexit is one of the biggest supporters, or two of the biggest supporters of Britain leaving the European Union. One was Putin, the other was Trump. And that tells you a lot, I think, about the wisdom of both Putin and Trump. Think that the UK leaving the European Union is going to weaken the European Union, and it's going to weaken the UK. And I would argue also it weakens the West. But there we are. Okay, my three scenarios for the future, and these they're created out a little bit out of thin air, but I think they're things just for you to think about. One of them is substantial continuity, looking to say in the next decade. One is radical positive change, and the third one is radical negative change. And let me go through them. In the substantial continuity scenario, very little changes, the trend lines that have been laid down by history. The United States remains committed to participate in the defense of Europe, to deploy substantial numbers of troops, and to retain military leadership of NATO, with a senior American general serving as NATO's Supreme Allied Commander. Post-Trump administrations try to repair damage done to U.S. leadership of the alliance without abandoning concerns that the United States still has about burden sharing. All current allies remain in the alliance, despite some wavering, Turkey, for example, and others experimenting with forms of democracy that do not conform exactly to the values specified or implied in the North Atlantic Treaty. With the United Kingdom having abandoned its EU membership, the EU continues with some successes and some failures in attempts to give the Union a more substantial integrated military capacity. The UK makes some cooperative military arrangements with its former EU partners while seeking a continued special relationship with the United States, including intelligence sharing. In this potential future, several allies spend around 2% of their gross domestic product on defense by 2024, as was agreed in the 2014 Wales Summit, while others fall short. So that's my more or less continuity scenario. Radical positive change. In this future, the goal of a more balanced transatlantic relationship comes more clearly into view. The United States remains committed to the alliance while supporting European efforts progressively to take on more responsibilities and burdens in the alliance. The members of the EU make substantial advances in coordinating and even integrating their defense establishments. A true European army under the control of a politically united Europe remains out of reach. But all EU members increasingly sacrifice bits of their national control of forces in a variety of pragmatic, cooperative arrangements. The UK, despite its departure from the European Union, commits to thorough defense cooperation with EU members while remaining fully committed to NATO. Increased European spending on defense is accompanied by the revitalization of the European defense industry, with multinational firms and co-production arrangements setting up a healthy competition across the Atlantic, whose sharp edges are moderated by stronger transatlantic defense industrial cooperation as well. Stronger European contribution to defense is acknowledged with alternating European and American Supreme Allied Commanders of NATO as a transition to a possible future in which Europeans routinely hold this post. The role of Secretary General, the political leader of the alliance, also alternates between prominent European and North American political leaders. This takes me to the third scenario, which is a much more negative one. Radical negative change. This much darker future would see the United States essentially abandoning its transatlantic commitments and leadership roles, while its European allies fall into disputes about how to maintain their security and provide new leadership. Such a scenario could be initiated by the re-election of Donald Trump to another 4-year term as American president. In fact, I would argue that that is the only way that this scenario will happen, is with the election of Donald Trump. In this hypothetical scenario, Trump continues the process of abandoning U.S. international leadership in his second term and decides to remove all U.S. forces from Europe. Trump tweets that he and Vladimir Putin have agreed that a move such as that, removing U.S. troops from Europe, would promote peace and security in Europe. In response, the European allies discussed creating strong integrated European defense structures to replace the transatlantic NATO one, but find it too challenging politically and financially. Even the projection made in 2019 by the International Institute for Strategic Studies that overwhelming financial commitments would be required of EU members to create a defense system as capable as that of NATO on their own terms turns out to be overly optimistic. Several EU countries suggest that the EU should follow the US lead and sign a peaceful relations accord with Russia, in which both sides pledge to take no aggressive actions against the interests of the others. Even though some commentators immediately labeled this the 21st century Munich, most European governments decide they have little choice. In addition, the move toward accommodation with Russia strengthens illiberal pro-Moscow parties throughout Europe and produces several national administrations that lean toward more fascist form of government than liberal democracy. Okay, that's a wide range of possibilities that I see that affects the future of the European Union and the future of NATO. George Santayana's wise saying that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it is popular for a good reason. We do need to learn from history, even if it doesn't predictably repeat itself. Some say if it doesn't repeat itself, at least it does rhyme. The fact that these creative decisions in the late 1940s, early 1950s produced systems of security and cooperation among the transatlantic democracies for over 7 decades should not be forgotten. With all its imperfections and sources of disagreements, this system that still is supported institutionally primarily by NATO and the European Union makes its own case for preservation. Those who argue for major changes in the arrangement still must bear the burden of proving that they have a better idea. So will history return to somewhat more reliable and familiar patterns, as suggested in the continuity model that I've outlined? Or will the forces of disruption steer the transatlantic democracies in very different and potentially dangerous directions? The West that we know and love is still composed of democracies. And what does this mean? This means that we all have choices to make. We can choose to sustain and improve our Western systems, or we can decide to let them fade away and let the forces of fascism, illiberalism, supported by Trump, preferred by China, we can let that take our countries away. Well, it's up to us, and it all is determined by voting, because we still are, fortunately, democracies. And my perspective is that the collision between history and disruptive forces of change still is posing a huge challenge to the United States, Europe, and Canada. And I guess to quote Donald Trump, we will see what happens.
Stan, thank you very much for your presentation, and I can promise that his answering questions will be probably, due to my experience, in a very frank way, so we should almost immediately go into this process. I just want to say at the beginning I have overlooked 2 people. The new ambassador of Eritrea, Antun, is here, and an old friend, Oberst Nada, Alta Nada. It's a great pleasure to see you. And now please, it's up to you just to ask all the questions that you would like to have answered, whether they are difficult or not, political or otherwise. Please use this opportunity. You will not regret it. Please go ahead. Who is the first one to ask a question? Yes, Ambassador, please.
I want to break the ice.
Could you
Well, I
please
appreciate that.
identify yourself for me, because
Yeah.
Ambassador Sultania,
Sultania, former ambassador of Iran to the United Nations International Organizations in Vienna for 12 years and in Geneva 3 years.
you were in my presentation here a year ago.
Yes,
so thought
yes,
around.
I had the pleasure to enjoy, and once again, I congratulate you about this comprehensive information you get. I have a couple of questions. Please elaborate on this decision of the Trump administration for withdrawal from INF, which led to Russians, and now we are in fact going into the situation there won't be any arms control left, because maybe the newest stock is the last one. Anyway, what would be impact on EU? At least I know that many of the EU countries expressed concern because of this INF being dead, and also the missiles to be deployed in Europe. The other issue is, which is domain of my work in disarmament and nuclear disarmament, we have been very disappointed with the gesture of NATO and all NATO allies collectively boycotting the nuclear ban treaty for banning nuclear weapon. Negotiation was banned, and also even those under umbrella of US, even Japan, who is the only victim of nuclear weapon, was prevented to negotiate and participate and cooperate. But this ban treaty is adopted by United Nations, and Austria is among the countries who have ratified, in fact, this treaty. This is very odd. This was the first polarization in EU, and of course, the NATO tried to push and pressure. I know that NATO has even put pressure on Sweden and others not to join. And these are the things that create questions, serious questions on the NATO, how the NATO is going on. The NATO is interfering in the country's democratic relation and decision for joining a treaty for international security. And of course, the last question is, there are a couple of other questions, but I don't take more time. How do you explain the Turkish decision having the S-40s, OS-400s and others, and military cooperation with Russians while being a member of NATO? Forgive me, the last one is the nuclear weapon of US employed in Europe, which is in full contravention with the Treaty of NPT, is a matter of concern, of course. And I have given a paper on this one, which is published, but I would be appreciative if any of the panel would touch upon this issue. These are serious questions about where NATO is going on and what is the future. Thank you.
thank you. May I ask another one? Second was Oberst Nader.
Colonel Nader, also an MD. I have one question relating to the relationship with Russia. You portrait various liberal movements as being very pro-Russian. And I guess that we are here in Chatham House rules, so I dare a provocative question. What do you think about Austria? Austria also has, in spite of annexation of Crimea, a very close position towards Russia and a very, let's say, positively and friendly relationship with this country. Thank you.
Okay, you are challenged. Please go ahead.
I think there's more there than I have the confidence to respond to. Now, let me start with the Austria question. Austria is not alone with the European countries. There was a recent poll, I don't know if you saw that asked respondents in Austria and other European countries if there were a war between the United States and Russia, would you support the United States? Would you support Russia, or would you be neutral? Well, you can guess what the Austrian response was. About well over 90% was neutral, right? And that's perhaps more understandable with Austria because of the tradition and the history and the bias. But what was surprising is so many European countries joined Austria, not quite at the same level favoring neutrality. And there were a few that even seemed, of the ones that weren't favoring neutrality, the few cases where even some said they would support Russia. Now, talking to somebody who also looked at this poll suggested, well, perhaps if the question were if there were a war in Europe, who would you support, Russia, the United States, or neutral, and that may have produced in different responses. But it is concerning to Americans, particularly when, at the same time, in the same time frame, just a few weeks ago, the Chicago Council in the United States released a very reliable polling data which shows that in the United States, almost 75% of Americans support NATO. Now, this has gone up during the Trump administration from in the high 60s into the mid-70s. And what does this say? This says that there still is strong support for NATO in the United States, and that in fact, to some extent, Trump's radical behavior has perhaps even strengthened that support, which is, I think, interesting. But what is problematic is looking at American opinion and then looking at the European opinions and asking how long can the American opinion be sustained if Europeans have such a bad opinion of the United States and say that they would remain neutral for the most part in a conflict between Russia and the United States. That, I think, I'm not going to broadcast that poll too heavily in the United States because I think it could seriously undermine American support for remaining supportive of Europe. And I'm just waiting to see if Trump supporters will pull out that poll and say, look, see, they're taking advantage of us, which is, as you know, Trump's line. I happen to believe that the relationship between the United States and Europe needs to be a cooperative one. The United States benefits from supporting Europe, and Europe benefits greatly from supporting the United States. We'll have our differences. We've had a lot of differences, and that will continue in the future. But abandoning that relationship, I think, would be treacherous. And even though Austria is not a member of NATO, it is a partner of NATO, it participates in NATO, some NATO activities. I very often see an Austrian officer at the NATO college when I lecture there. And so there is a relationship that benefits even Austria. Austria has probably been the luckiest free rider on defense, and say that in front of a former defense minister here. But in any case, that's my response to your question.
Thank you.
The other questions really come down to Western attitudes toward arms control. And you've raised a great variety of questions, but let me put it in terms of general arms control context. The current administration in the United States does not believe in arms control, just as it does not believe in multilateral cooperation, which is one part of its abandonment of the Iran nuclear agreement and all of that. It does not believe or have faith in multilateral cooperation. I happen to disagree with that attitude. On the other hand, the INF Treaty was undone first by Russia, by developing a missile system that clearly in violation of the INF Treaty. And I think that that was used as an excuse by the administration to get out of the INF Treaty. And because of the INF Treaty poses some obstacles to what the United States thinks it might have to do in Asia in terms of deploying missiles in that range at some point in the future. So it's a very complex picture, but the fact is you have to start from the assumption that the administration does not believe in arms control. I happen to be a believer in arms control. I first came to Vienna in 1973 as a member of the U.S. delegation to mutual and balanced force reductions. I worked hard on trying to promote the concepts of reducing military forces in Europe. And subsequently, when I worked for the Congress, I did a lot of analysis of SALT and START and so forth. And so I'm a believer in arms control when you have a partner who can be trusted. And right now, I don't know whether the United States is trustworthy, and I don't know whether we have a partner in Russia that can be trusted. Right now, I'm not sure I trust either. And I think the future of arms control, therefore, will wait to see what happens, at least in the United States, to see if there is a new approach. I think that many of the Democratic candidates for presidency will look at arms control and try to see if there are any approaches to arms control that could be useful for U.S. interests. I think they also will look at the Iran arrangement and perhaps try to reinstate that, renegotiate it, to take it down the road further. So that's a simple answer to your very complex question.
Maybe Turkey? Question of
Turkey.
Turkey?
Turkey, of course, is a huge disappointment from anyone who supports the transatlantic relationship. We all had hopes that Turkey would be an example of a country in that region with an Islamic population, a majority population, that actually remained a secular state, as Ataturk had established it, and so a big disappointment. On the other hand, I understand in many ways, I understand why Turkey is headed in the direction it's headed in. Erdogan is obviously, he is an illiberal politician who is establishing a strong illiberal regime in Turkey, and so that's kind of a separate thing. But he was able to do that partly because I think the EU screwed up, to put it frankly. I think the EU led Turkey on to believe that it could actually become a member of the EU at some point in the future. From all my discussions over the years with Europeans, I never found great sincerity about that. And I think there was good reason for Turkish people to believe that the EU was never going to really invite Turkey to come into the organization. And I hate to be as blunt about that as I am, but I do think that the European Union does hold some blame, and that this provided Erdogan excuses to go where he's gone. And I'm sure that there's plenty of blame to go around that the United States. I wish that the United States, I wrote, tried to get a program started at National Defense University when I was part of a transatlantic group there to look at the question of what the United States could do to try to solidify Turkey's position in the alliance. This was before the Erdogan period, because I saw that the EU connection was not going to be the anchor that would keep Turkey in the alliance. And now we have Turkey not only weakening in terms of its commitment to the values inside the alliance, but also weakening in terms of its orientation toward the West. And of great concern, obviously, is the game that he's playing with Putin. We don't know exactly, I don't know what that game is, but it's a dangerous one, I think. So I'm concerned, I'm worried. I just came back from, say, my lecture at the NATO College in Rome. Turkey sent, I think, 10 officers or civilians to this class in the college. It's the senior course. That's more than, I think, any other NATO ally, including the United States and Germany and France, are all send large contingents. And so they're trying to show, at least, that they want to maintain the connection. And every time I say something that is critical about Turkey there at the college, I get responses from these people who feel they have to ask why I'm being so critical. And my answer usually is, I'm critical of my government as well. And so I think I have similar concerns about yours. And so I'm not standing on a platform when I know that I need to be critical of my own government as well as yours, and for the same reasons. And they tend to accept that. Most of them are younger people, and I know that they feel they have to defend their country, but they also tend to understand where I'm coming from. So I appreciate that. I'm hoping that at some point new generations of Turkish citizens will move themselves back, their country back into a position that's more part of the West. That's my hope, and I think we should work in that direction.
Thank you. Next question, yeah. Dr. Haidar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sloan. be sure that Europeans like Americans. I think we know that you helped us a lot, especially in the after and during the Second World War and afterwards. This I want to say. My big question is why Americans are so obsessed by Russia generally. Because Russia, when we look very to the facts, Russia has an economy as big as maybe Italy plus 20%, and the army maybe 10% of NATO. I think the real danger or challenge, I wouldn't even say danger, is China. And also the world completely changed in the 21st century, because now we have a rising Africa, which will have 4 trillion people in the year 2050. So even the Chinese will look small compared to Africa. So things will fundamentally change, and especially I have one question. You know, the Chinese came with the Belt and Road project initiative, and they invest a lot of money. Why do the Americans, they have like a lot of defense budget, why don't they use, let's say, 20% of the defense budget for a similar initiative? Let's call it a co-prosperity, world co-prosperity initiative, and not just build like military bases, which they have everywhere in the world, yeah, but also like the Chinese economic basis, and I think in cooperation with Europe they could outdo China like nothing. But I think still with NATO, this is my perception, there is still the mindset of the 20th century, and I feel somehow the West has to go beyond it. What is your answer to this question?
Thank you. Next one, Shaka.
Thank you very much. My name is Lukas Wank. I'm the director of the Think and Do Tank Shapka, and I'm also a 2018 and 19 fellow of the German Marshall Fund. And I have a quick question, because it seems to me that policy-wise and structure-wise, the transatlantic relationship is very much being focused on a transatlantic security cooperation, security alliance that is institutionalized in NATO, of course. And I was wondering if you would see, like beyond that security pillar of the transatlantic relations, if you would see new civilian avenues of cooperation between Europe and Northern America, I would say, Canada and US. Thank you.
Sure. Matt, maybe?
On the Russia preoccupation, yes, the United States and NATO in general remain preoccupied with Russia. And yes, the fact is that Russia is very weak economically. It's well outdone by our state of California. It's really a very weak, economically weak power. Problem is, it also has nuclear weapons on intercontinental ballistic missiles that could destroy the United States, say nothing of Europe. And so we have a lot of Western military experts. I don't consider myself an expert in military forces, but a lot of Western military experts believe that Russia also has the non-nuclear capacity to at least take the Baltic states and control them again. And in addition to that, there's plenty of evidence that Russia has very actively worked recently to support illiberal political parties in the United States and in Europe. And so there is a continued perception of a threat. Russia's actions can unfortunately tend to perpetuate this problem. You know, think back to the 1990s. In the 1990s, sure, it was chaotic in Russia, but there was a beginning of thinking that maybe Russia could actually change And at that point, the whole idea, well, you don't need arms control with a country that is a friendly country. We don't have arms, the U.S. doesn't have arms control agreements with France or the UK. They're friendly countries, and maybe at some point Russia could get to that point. But Russia didn't go to that point because the chaos was too much for the Russian people, and it was too destabilizing, and Putin provided the answer, and that is to go back to an authoritarian style government, and so there we are. I think you're right that we should be and will become increasingly concerned about China and its activities. I think you've suggested a very creative proposal, but you know what would happen in the United States? The first, if we were going to take 20% out of defense spending, you know where it would go first? To healthcare, to social issues in the United States, to the opioid crisis. There are lots of domestic issues that we have that we need to deal with, and I think you'll see if the Democrat is elected president, there'll be more focus on that, although politics in the United States will insist the Democrats don't reduce defense efforts substantially in any way, or they'll become vulnerable to the Republicans next time around. We're kind of trapped in many ways by history, by our own ideas of security, and it's very difficult to start to think about the kind of creative suggestion that you made. And we're going to have to struggle along with dealing with those presumptions and assumptions about what we need to do. So I appreciate the creativity, and there obviously is reason to be more concerned about China. And the interesting thing, of course, is that we're at the point where Europe and the United States have mutual dependencies with China. And in some ways, this may actually be a good thing. I mean, China still holds a very large amount of American securities, American debt, and that places some constraints on what the United States can do, and it places constraints on what China can do. So there's some protection from the most radical behaviors between us. And Europe, of course, has lots of interest in trading with China. I think what's happening, though, is we're becoming more concerned about the potential security implications of those mutual dependencies. And I think that's a good thing. I'm not saying we should instantly say, well, pound the table and say China's our new enemy, but we have to be more concerned about what Chinese motivations and intentions are, and that, say, is the direction that I'm sure we're moving in at the moment. Is it possible for and I'd like my colleagues perhaps to respond to this as well, to go beyond security and in the transatlantic relationship. I always say that one of the great burdens that NATO bears is that it is the main symbol of transatlantic relations. And if things are going poorly in security affairs, then it's perceived that the overall relationship is bad. At this point, with the Trump administration, we have problems both in the trade area and the security area, so it kind of spreads across the relationship. And I don't see, with an administration in the United States that is so skeptical about multilateralism, I don't see much potential for expanding the relationship beyond security and into other areas of cooperation. There are lots of areas, I think there are already, and you know more about this than I, already many areas of cooperation beyond security, and they can be strengthened. We need to deal with environmental issues. We need to deal with drug issues. We need to deal with a whole variety of problems that go beyond security. And to the extent the United States and Europe can work more effectively on those issues, I think would be good, but it's not going to happen under this administration in the United States. Either of you like to respond to that?
Well, maybe we should refer to the gentleman. I'm nothing much to add to Mr. Wank. I think that there's a lot of sort of rumor that there's a lot of anti-Russian hysteria around Europe, and that, in a way, is not fully correct. I agree with you. I mean, Europe is trying to make these bridges with Russia, but I wouldn't call it irrational. You know, I mean, what the Russians did in the Caucasus, what they've done in Ukraine, and it fully justifies what NATO has been doing. So, I mean, deploying troops in Poland and in the Baltics is fully sort of supported by these states, by the people of these countries, and I mean, if you look at the opinion polls, you would see these countries like Baltic states and Poland and Ukraine that they're fully in support. I mean, Ukraine being outside, but the majority of the population is now looking toward NATO now as an umbrella of protection. So I wouldn't call it necessarily as like anti-Russian hysteria, which I mean, like war-mongering hysteria. Now, from the German or Austrian Central European perspective, it's quite different. You have like two layers or two buffer zones in between Germany and Russia, and it's really, I mean, you have more comfort in doing business. So I mentioned that before. The clearest example is Nord Stream. You have Austrian companies, you have a lot of German and French companies involved. They perceive it as solely as doing business. And of course, you have to take the side of the Poles and the countries and nations that have been oppressed by the USSR for almost 5 decades. So the whole idea is to have unanimous stand and platform to the third parties. You know, it's not correct to make certain pacts, you know, with the third parties and not regarding the interests of all allies, and we should stand together now. But then again, we're opening, you know, Pandora box at the moment, because we have so much division between European countries. You know, the Brits opting to get out, even though they don't know how to pull it out, and the big burden of this crisis, you know, it's still here. The spirit is still here. You know, the Italians and the Greeks and even the Spaniards, they still feel the effects of this crisis, and they tend to blame for the French and German banks and for the debt crisis, and Eastern European nations, and not to mention the Balkans, and not to mention, you know, like countries like Serbia, they want to join the EU, and now they're joining the Euro-Asian Union. So your question, you know, goes into deep layers of Europe, and what I can answer is that the West itself and Europe is facing the biggest crisis we ever faced ever since 1945. And if European Union survives this crisis, I believe that Europe will be a fine place to live in again.
Yeah, maybe just a few words. In addition to that, from my side, trial for explanation. What is the difference between the Americans and the Europeans versus the Russian threat? For the Americans, Russia is the only one that really can provide an existential threat. Nobody else can. And therefore, probably compared to others, this is something that is irritating for the most powerful country of the world that was dominating the hemisphere in such a way. For the Europeans, although they are immediate neighbors and they have more or less similar conditions, it is not. Why? Probably because for the Europeans, they do not look at the nuclear and the missiles threat in a similar way to the Americans, but because they know, okay, this would also be the damage for the Russians. It's rather the conventional threat. And therefore, there is a difference. And if you look to the situation within Europe, you can say there's a completely different threat perception. Even in the Central European countries. You have usually the Nordic countries, Baltic countries and Poland that have a high threat perception from Russia. If you go to Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, there's nothing. In Romania, there is some, due to Moldova, Transnistria, and insofar it is quite different. I would say most of the Europeans who are interested in having good relationships with the Russians, but also from a European understanding, of course it cannot be accepted. European Union principally is open for every European country. And if Europe just would look aside and say, okay, if somebody is not only against those tendencies, but can occupy anybody who wants to join us and just take away territory, this would mean that the whole of Europe is only Sunday preaching and not more. I mean, there would be more or less no trust and no belief in the own principles. European Union could give up itself as a community of values, as far as I see. And insofar we are in a situation that, okay, there is an interest of coming closer, not being hostile, but of course, the question is, when can you do it? European Union cannot say, we give up our principles. They only can act when there is clear steps from the Russian side. And if you look to the threat perception on the other hand, you know, Putin established, as Stan told us, that Putin was very successful to say NATO is more dangerous for Russia than vice versa. Of course, this is not true. I mean, if you look specifically